we will be we'll be going through a short presentation just to kind of give an overview of one of the things that really is affecting bees in a pretty major way. And so we're going to just talk, we'll have a little short presentation from Dave and Bret for the first little segment, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So let me first give a quick introduction about the beekeepers. Let me pull up my notes here. So Dave Hackenberg, who is on right now, Dave began keeping bees as an FFA project in 1962 in high school. And by the time he had graduated, he had already started his own business, maintaining several hundred hives. Over time, he built his business to include 3,000 bee colonies, but in November 2006, Dave lost 80% of his hives due to CCD, colony collapse disorder. He's credited with the discovery of CCD. He and his son now run Hackenberg apiaries, 1,500 active bee colonies. I'm not sure if that's current number, Dave, or if that's changed. So after serving as president of the Pennsylvania State Beekeepers Association, the American Beekeeping Federation, and as a member of the National Honey Board, he holds the position of the co-chairman of the Honeybee Health Advisory Board. And he has been on the Pollinator Stewardship Council for a very long time, I believe, since the beginning. Bret is, let's see if he's on yet. I don't see him on quite yet. He is a third-generation commercial beekeeper based in Bruce, South Dakota. Along with his family, he runs Adee Honey Farms, one of the largest beekeeping operations in the world, producing honey and offering pollination services. He's a founding member of Pollinator Stewardship Council, and he served as board president from 2014 to 2020. He's also served on the National Honeybee Advisory Board, was a founding member of the Pollinator Defense Fund. He's been featured in media outlets, including New York Times and NPR, and documentaries, including Vanishing the Bees and The Pollinators, which is also, likewise, Dave has been featured in those as well. So I felt like it was a good idea to offer this webinar. Pollinator Stewardship Council does a lot of work around education, advocacy, for pollinator health. And we have some really amazing board members with just like an incredible body of knowledge. And so what we're trying to do is to offer a webinar workshop kind of on a quarterly basis that's available to folks as kind of our educational outreach. And we thought that this might be a great opportunity for beekeepers to talk to commercial beekeepers with kind of like a huge amount of experience and be able to ask the questions. So the format of this is that we will do a short presentation. I'm going to try to keep it kind of, keep it brief. I think it'll be really interesting to folks. And so we'll look just to be talking about some critical issues facing modern beekeepers. While this is happening and throughout the whole hour that we're going to spend together, please feel free to just go ahead and put your questions into the chat at any time. Make sure we capture all of them. If your question's complicated, it's okay. Just say I have a question or just do a brief overview. And then at the end, after the presentation, we'll save a big chunk of time and we'll kind of just go through those in order. So I want to make sure that I'm able to capture the questions, we don't miss anything. And if you have just noted, oh, I have a question, then again, feel free to unmute yourself to share details and discuss as needed. But what we'll do is just allow Bret and Dave to kind of get started on this and go through the presentation. So I'm going to be forwarding the slides, and let's see here. We'll go ahead and just get, let's see, Bret or Dave, these first ones. I do have a segment where Dave's going to talk in a dozen slides or so for a little bit, but I don't know who wants to weigh in on this and start the presentation.
Well, I'm the only one. Bret's not with us yet. I guess he had some issues. He said he'd be here by the time we got started. But
okay.
So we're looking here at this slide. It says the average loss right now is 48.2%. I was just in Washington last week or week before, and those numbers haven't changed. And of course, people and running businesses like myself and Bret, our losses can run as high as 70, 95%, but the average across the United States And these losses have changed drastically since the days when I started keeping bees. I mean, if we had back in the 60s and 70s, if we had 5 to 10% losses, we thought we were bad beekeepers. So something, has really changed over a period of time, and that's where we're trying to, get to the bottom of all that. And as we deal with more and more pesticides, whether it's fungicides or insecticides or whatever, we see that we have a lot more issues. And one of the things is that mites become a lot more susceptible. The bees become more susceptible to the mites. There's a new study just came out in the last day or so that proves some of the things we've been saying for a long time, but somebody finally got it in printing some way with some degrees behind their name, and scientifically. And what we're saying is, is backed up by numbers.
Great. And I do have a slide about that later on, Dave. So, yeah.
So how, most of you on here, you say, well, I treated the mites and my bees still died. Well, maybe the mites weren't the problem. Mites might have been part of the problem, but what something else is going on. I'm from the day when, I remember before varroa mites. I'm in my 70s, so I remember a lot of good times. But when mites first came, you had a hive of bees that had 50, 100 mites. You treated them, and that was the end of it. And you're good for another year. And that doesn't work anymore. So there's other things coming into consideration.
Yeah, and go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry.
We're drowning in toxicity, exposure from the chemicals that back in my earlier days, if something, you got a bee kill, what killed your bees. I mean, it was something dead that killed them dead. Now the problem is the chemicals we're using out here are systemic. They have different modes of action, and some of this stuff can be lingering. Like a conversation American Beekeeping Federation, we were with EPA for a couple hours last week, several hours, and we talked about the mixing of chemicals and finding pollen samples is the size of your little finger, the tip of your little finger, with as high as 100 different insecticides and pesticides on that, and other toxic things. So there's a lot of, the bees are coming in contact with a lot of things. And the thing about a honeybee colony is the wax is very absorbent of most of this stuff, because most of it rides on an oil base or whatever. And so the wax absorbs all this. And even though you might have been around this stuff months ago, it's still there. There's Bret, you're on there. We can you hear us, or he's still trying to get on, I guess?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, good. I've been trying. I have
you want to pick up the conversation with this slide?
Yeah, let's see. Well, completely. We'll minimize this here. So yeah, I mean, pesticides are probably the main thing. Dave was talking about the old days, and I can remember, if we had over a 5% loss, we figured we were doing something extremely wrong. And if I could get to that point where I had over I remember we had one man that was managing some bees with us, and he had like a 7% loss. And I told my dad, he's got to go. That's unacceptable, 7% loss. I'd give that man the biggest bonus ever if I could get that again. But anyway, the pesticides are impacting us quite a few ways. The acute is, when they die right away, and then you got your chronic effects. And this is where most beekeepers don't get, you don't get it. It's because it happens. Your bees, you don't know when it happens. It happens to me all the time. It happens to Dave all the time. It happens to every commercial beekeeper all the time. Your bees are out on a landscape in a farming situation. and you have no idea where those bees are picking up all their pollens from, and somebody might throw a fungicide on or an insecticide, or even some of the herbicides are really damaging the bee physiology. There's Dave was talking about papers, and I could just give you more papers than you can imagine, because I've studied this like a doctorate level. But then these effects come in months later after the bee's been exposed to these different pesticide classes. There's a paper that just came out of Wisconsin here probably a year or so ago, and they showed glyphosate, aka Roundup, promotes a bacteria that just destroys the bees, a gut bacteria that just destroys the bees' opportunity or ability to survive the winter. And so, if you get exposed to Roundup during the summer and that affects the bees' digestive tract, this microbe in the digestive tract will grow, and then when it turns cold, your bees fall apart. I mean, that's just one thing. And you have the neonics Dave was talking about. That's kind of the real obvious one that everybody knows about, because its toxicity is so powerful. It's like clothianidin, if I remember correctly, is 5,000 times more powerful than DDT was. Imidacloprid is about 7,000 times more toxic than DDT. So it doesn't take much to really mess up a bee. And then, you have this category over here that's called synergistics. And when you combine that with the fungicides, some of the fungicides, or adjuvants, they work different ways, but they'll increase the toxicity sometimes by 10, 20, or even 100-fold. And some of them will increase the toxicity over 1,000-fold. So if you have something all of a sudden that was 5,000 more times toxic than DDT, and then you get some fungicide in with that, and all of a sudden you can be talking 20, 30,000 times hotter than DDT. And we've come across some agrochemicals in the fungicide side of things that react with our miticides. And your miticide, your bees, you think you're doing everything exactly right, and you're on a pollination contract, and the neighbor's raising nectarines down the road, and he sprays something on his nectarines, and that reacts with our miticide. And if you're using like an apivar strip, and it'll make the apivar so hot that it'll kill the bees. So anyway, this is just a lot of the issues we've been trying to address with the PSC. We've been making comment letters, probably for going on 12 years now. And, some people ask, why you guys waste your time making these comment letters to the EPA? And the reason we make comment letters to the EPA with the Pollinator Stewardship Council is, if you don't make a comment when they're registering a new insecticide, you have no, what they call in the courtroom, standing. So you cannot do anything if it's harming the bees. You just got to take it and get kicked in the teeth. And so there was one that we had a very successful lawsuit on. It was called Cephaloxiflor. And we went to court, and Dave and I and the rest of the board were there, and we were in the court, and the judge looked at this data, and he said to the Dow Chemical, he says, I wouldn't take this from a high school student. He says, one of the primary things in toxicology is you have to keep your subjects alive, or your controls alive. And they had killed 75% of the control bees and killed 80% of the subject bees. And so they said it was no statistical difference, and they wanted it licensed. And that product was just super destructive to bees. And we had a small victory there, but this is why we do what we do, is trying to make the world a better place for bees. First, and just like Dave, we all start out for economic reasons, because we're trying to protect our business. But once you study this long enough, you say, this is way bigger than my business. We got to do this for our kids and our grandkids. We don't want to leave, a messed up world to them. So anyway, I started out for completely economic reasons. And it's like, once you start smelling the coffee, you realize it's way bigger than economics. So anyway, that's what I'll say about pesticides and pollinators, it's a real awakening, and it's a rude awakening. I wish I was never awoken to this. It ruined my life, and it's ruined my bees. But anyway, once you're involved in it, you can't let it, you can't get uninvolved because you know what's going on.
One thing, Bret and Dave, that I learned once I started working with the Pollinator Stewardship Council is that in my mind, when I thought about bees being exposed to pesticides, I always envisioned like an acute exposure, right? Like I imagined that this is what it looks like. You know, someone sprays and then the bees die. And what I have come to understand is while that is really obvious and that's something that is unfortunate and does happen, that really the thing is, you know, that we see way more of is this sublethal and chronic exposure over time. Is that right? Am I right on that?
Oh,
Yeah, Jennifer, that's, you know, the stuff you see there in that picture before, you know, where the bees are dead. We still see a lot of that, you know, and we had a case here in Pennsylvania just about a month ago where the Forest Service sprayed bees with, which is interesting too for all of you on here. So they sprayed with a product called -2 LV, which is a growth regulator. It's supposed to kill the larvae, not supposed to affect any, you know, adults. Well, guess what? It didn't only kill larvae, it killed bees. We got pictures of lots of dead bees on the ground. You know, talking with EPA, and they said, well, you know, that the studies say that that's not supposed to do that. Well, when you pay the chemical company to do the study, you know, if you don't produce a study that says what you want it to say, it's like Bret keeps saying, it's like the kid going to college and taking a test, writing his own test, grading his own test, and giving himself a grade. Well, that's how this whole thing works.
That's something that I was totally unaware of. I mean, I felt like before I joined the PSC that I was, you know, involved in sort of like, you know, environmental stewardship and had a good grasp of things. And that's something that I just was totally unaware of, was that when licensing happens through the EPA with a new product, that there's no outside like third party objective, or even like the EPA, no one is doing those kinds of studies, right? This is that the chemical manufacturer, the applicant, is the one who is responsible for conducting the studies. So yeah, so we see this sublethal and chronic exposure over time, as, you know, and this is what is often missed. And it's the hard part, I think, for beekeepers in particular who are unaware of this. They just think that they're doing something wrong, or they're not sure what's going on. This slide, I think Steve Ellis, who is our current board president, he, I think, shared this slide with me. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that I thought was really interesting. I like to include it because one of the things, like, this is a pesticide, or insecticide rather, for termites, and what it does is it causes them to cease their natural grooming behavior, and so they have to groom in order to stay alive. So if they stop grooming, the fungi in the soil attack and kill them. And so it doesn't actually kill them outright, but it changes their behaviors. And so this is a product that's actually designed to interrupt social behavior, and bees are, you know, social insects. And so to see this, so this is not the only type of thing, you know, termites are not the only thing that are impacted by this. So here is a systemic, you know, pesticide that is designed to kill with this low dose, you know, over time. And so anyway, just really it was pretty eye-opening for me. And then does anyone, Bret or Dave, does this give kind of a quick overview of what we see, what you're seeing in as effects of that chronic exposure?
So if you go into a beehive and you see pollen there that looks like it's capped over with some real dark, heavy caps, and you pick that open, you're going to probably find some pollen under there that's really dark in color. If you were to send that pollen out and have it tested, and with pollen from right next to it that's open, you would probably find that pollen has got 1,000, at least hundreds, maybe thousands of times more toxicity than the pollen that's next to it, because the bees had enough sense to cap that over and just basically seal it forever. Unfortunately, that still migrates through the comb, and helps reduce the population and pairs the queens and all the other things. And of course, when you get down to wintering, you don't have good bees going in the winter. You got to have good winter bees going in the winter. If you ain't developing winter bees, you don't have good wintering.
I'm going to forward through because we're going to try to get through some of the pretty quickly, so we have plenty of time for questions. I think we kind of covered this a little bit in overall, but the next slide shows, I think it's imidacloprid. So maybe Bret or Dave, do you want to talk about seed coatings or these maps?
Bret, go ahead. Did we lose him?
Maybe. Let's see.
So next, especially in corn, clethodim, which is the terminal, is the right chemical that's used for seed coating, was actually never approved until October of 2003. And as you watch these maps, you're also going to see the spread of imidacloprid, which is on the other neonic, but also at the same time, as you watch this, and you see it only gets to a point there in 2014 or whatever the year is, and then they quit keeping records. Yes, that was 14, I think, is the last. So after 2014, there is no records of how much more spread there's been. And if you look at that spread of the chemicals over the nation there. But the interesting thing, and Bret will tell you this, and other people can tell you this too, I was the person that sounded the alarm in 2006, but I started to see problems as early as 2003. They were using this stuff in Eastern Canada as seed treatment on potatoes in the 90s, and some of that you see in the early 90s here, or in the late 90s here, was actually seed treatment up in Maine and places like that on potatoes and some other products. And I was like everybody else. I looked at the farm magazines. I read all kinds of farm magazines and still do. And they sold this stuff as a product that was only going to target the targeted insect. It's going to take out the corn borer and grubs on the beans and so on and so forth. But anyhow, they brought it on the market, supposedly. It was registered in 03. I started seeing problems actually in the fall of 03, and of course I didn't know what it was because this stuff wasn't really on the market. Come to find out that right here in my backyard, one of the largest seed corn salesmen for the cob, which is owned by the chemical industry, was right here. One of my neighbors, friend of the family at one time, and he proceeded to tell me I was full of whatever. But before he passed away, he called me one day and told me, he said, yes, he said, we planted corn with experimental treatment on it as early as 2001. Right next to my holding yards, right on the Susquehanna River. So and basically it takes a couple of years in the soil before it starts to show itself. And I basically had a head start on everybody in the country. And it wasn't until, 06, 07, 08 when the Midwest started seeing all the, if you look at these numbers, you can see how it spread.
Well, and one of the things I think that's particularly awful about this, right, is that they, like Dave said, that they stopped tracking this, and that the treated seed said on the prior slide, right, that treated seed is it's not tracked. So it actually is the huge amount of neonics that are treated with this. They're planted with these treated seeds, and so we have this like enormous application that's happening that we have no data. There's this sort of loophole that exists that doesn't count as an application because it is not sprayed or applied.
It's called the treated seed exemption, and so the chemical companies went to bat long before they ever brought it out. They'd gone to bat and got this approved with EPA that there's no traceability, there's no accountability for how much seed treatment it's the largest amount of chemical used anything in the world here in the United States. Well, it's here in the United States. The seed treatment. So there's no record of how many millions of pounds of seed treatments used each year, because at one point they were keeping records, and then as of 14 they ceased to keep any records.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some crazy facts about it, right? The like one treated seed can kill the songbird. I mean, yeah, just it's pretty toxic. So Dave, I thought maybe we could go through these really quickly. We're kind of running out of time, but do you want to go through these photos?
Yeah, bring up the next one. I'm trying to. This is a California scene. I can't remember exactly. Oh, this is the healthy bees and so on and so forth. Okay. So I don't remember what year it was. I got EPA to come to California. They wanted to see what was going on. We got top dogs at EPA to come to California.
Yeah,
and
it was 2014.
Bret, you were there. You want to go ahead and you go?
Yeah,
I set it up, and Bret was there. I couldn't make it.
Yeah, it was 2014, and this was very telling. And we saw nothing but good bees that day. Everybody had put a ton of resources into their bees, and there was lots of calling. And so I would say the average hive was probably between 10 and 12 frames of bees. Some were closer to 14. And there was, it looked good until we went and saw all the calls. And so we went over and looked at bees, and then we saw bees that were falling apart that were 2 and 3 framers. But we saw good bees, and you see pictures of good bees. And then this orchard here with the young trees, with the man working it there, that was a huge corporate orchard. And we had bees that came from agricultural situations where they'd been exposed all summer to, low levels of agrochemicals. And we took those hives apart, and we did a frame shake and nice drizzle of honey across the top of the hives. And then we went to the hives that came out of the high mountains, and they hadn't been exposed to agrochemicals at all. And the vigor in the hives was just you couldn't imagine how much difference the vigor was. And so we took the frames out, and we give them a shake, and it just drowned at the top of the hives. And the number one guy for the EPA was there, and his name is Dr. Jim Jones. And we saw this, and I had bees within 5 miles there, and the man that had the mountain bees, he was so happy with the condition of his bees. And less than 5 days later, he called me and says they sprayed fungicide all over that orchard during the middle of the day, and my bees have no vigor anymore. They look just like everybody else's bees. He was just totally brokenhearted, and I can understand why. And so I asked Dr. Jones, I said, hey, after what you've seen today, will you accelerate the time frame for the review of neonics? And he said, no, you bee guys are only losing 300 million a year, and we're protecting billions of dollars worth of crops. So I was a little indignant at that. And I said, Dr. Jones, you do not work for USDA. You work for EPA. It's your job to keep the environment healthy enough that my bees don't die. You don't have to keep me profitable. I said, and children don't get sick. And so then he starts kind of backpedaling just a little. And so I finally asked him, I said, what did you get your doctoral thesis in? And so, we're talking to the number one guy of pesticides at the EPA. You'd think he's a microbiologist, a toxicologist, molecular biologist, or a geneticist, something to do with the life sciences, organic sciences. I wrote my doctoral thesis in economics. It's like, so this is who's regulating us as economists. And they've come up with an idea that they call it the BEA, the Biological Economic Assessment. And this is how they decide if they're going to put a product into the environment, not really what its environmental damages are. They say, well, here's the crop. It's getting $2 billion worth of damages. It's a $20 billion crop, maybe, and it's getting $2 billion worth of damages, but for 300 million, we can spray it. So the country is ahead 101.7 billion. And that's how they put products into the market. They don't ever look, and this is what we're trying to pursue, And we've hired an economist right now that's working with the University of Chicago and doing economic studies. And we've got detectives trying to figure out where the EPA came up with their number and doing all the legal stuff to the Freedom of Information Act to see if we can find their number where they generated that 300 million from. But it's an incomplete thought, because in soybeans alone, I think soybeans are somewhere around a $45 billion crop. And with bees on the landscape, study after study shows that soybean yield increases 20 to 30%, depending on the distance from the field. And so, we're talking a $40 billion crop, and if bees are given 10% of that, it's like that's half of what the university studies show the pollination value is worth. It's like, that's a $4 to $8 billion improvement with just the honeybees on the landscape. So right now we're at this situation where honeybees or any of the beneficial insects, like your lacewings that eat aphids off the soybeans, there's no economic value given to them because they're beneficial, or lady beetles that will eat, aphids also, and on and on and on. In a lot of our production systems, the beneficials that either eat the good bugs that eat the bad bugs, or the bugs like we raise, honeybees that pollinate the crops, are not valued. So anyway, this is one of our challenges, is to bring some economic numbers here so we can get redress and we can get policy change. Because if we can get policy changed, then it's going to be a better environment for our kids and our grandkids. And, bees will go back to like when Dave and I were both a lot younger. You requeen bees at 3 years or 4 years and sometimes 5 years. You didn't have to requeen them every year, and the average life wasn't 6 months. The average life was about 3 years for a healthy colony. And so anyway, I'd love to see that again. And I think we can. What we're talking about is kind of dark and depressing, but I think we're on the edge of a real turnaround in agriculture. And, the prices for our production farmers are just terrible. And, that's what causes innovation. And so our old treadmill of, putting more chemicals on and putting more fertilizer on, that's broken. And I think we're at the point where, a lot of people are starting to ask questions. It's like, why am I working so hard and not getting anywhere? Dave has a young man that rents some of his ground that's just done a wonderful job of integrating these new ideas, reducing his cost, and having a much more healthy environment for his family, his crops, and Dave's honeybees. And it's the kind of renter that any man that has a land investment would love to have renting from him. And any man that lives in the country would want him for his neighbor, because it's just excellent how he's managing crops. He's planting there's a video on the pollinators movie where it shows him planting target crops that the bad bugs attack, so the good bugs, so the crop that he's trying to raise doesn't actually get affected at all. And so instead of spraying the whole field, he sprays a little strip 6 inches wide. It's just absolutely amazing. So, what we were talking about is a little dark at the beginning, but I think we have some real opportunity, and I think we're at the edge of a change. And so anyway, that's what keeps me going, because I see the change starting to happen. And if I was trying to put a number on it, I guess I read some actual numbers in the conventional magazines like Successful Farmer, and I think 8% of the farmers in the nation are now involved in what the idea is called regenerative agriculture, where they're using nature to give them what they were buying from the chemical companies before. And those 8% control, I think, 5% of the lands. They're not our biggest farmers, but they're medium-sized farmers. And I'm really encouraged by that. So anyway, even though we're kind of Debbie Downers here at the beginning, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I'm going to give a pitch for the PSC. We're trying to do economic studies to get policy changed and maybe get some redress so the beekeepers get a little bit of money for this damages. That's another idea in trying to get this economic studies. We're working right now on trying to get the monies together and looking at a bunch of science proposals to see how we can decontaminate comb, because we're all having dead outs. And we used to get a dead out, requeen it, and that hive would be very powerful, wonderful hive for several years. Now it's like, well, we requeen it. Some don't make the spring. And so there's all different types of ideas on how to clean up comb, from beekeeper ideas that are just completely mechanical to some of our top scientists saying, you know, ozone, hydrogen peroxide, radiation, ultraviolet light. So anyway, we're looking at proposals, and that's one of the things. So really appreciate if you guys would get involved with the PSC to help us move these two objectives forward, and then so we can continue also to make comment letters. So if something bad does show up, at least we have standing to say, hey, you need to work, you know. And it takes a while. This sulfoxaflor thing was a 3-year project, but we got it out of the market for a while, and then there was an end run and a lot of politics with the cotton people. But anyway, I think, you know, in my world, you have to try.
Well, and I
One
think
other little quick thing.
Go
One
ahead.
other quick thing before we start answering questions here or whatever. So, you know, somebody brought this to me in the last day or so, but, you know, they said, well, why do you sue EPA? Why do you sue EPA? Well, one of the first things that we learned, and probably before Bret's time in my days of going to EPA, and I've been going there since back in 08 or whatever, but they told us, if you want to change policy, our policy, the only way you can change policy here is you have to sue us. You know, we're all friends, but this is how policy and governments change. So, yes, we've sued, you know, as Bret and I both talked, we filed some lawsuits, and we've won them, and that's how policies change. And it doesn't make sense to you and I as beekeepers, but this is the way government operates. And just wanted to throw that in there. Somebody had a question the other day about why are you suing the government? Well, you know, they're telling us we want to change the policy. That's how you do it. So just letting you know.
Great. And so on the screen right now, thank you guys both very much. I mean, there's a slide I want to go back to just really quickly, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. On the screen right now, you should see a QR code if you're interested in becoming a member or donating, or if you're interested in hosting one of our board members to speak, you know, at your, you know, local beekeeping organization, that kind of thing. This will take you to the website, and you can find out more information. Also on the website, you'll find all kinds of educational materials. We're just about to make available a whole bunch of print materials. So look for that next month. There'll be a series of informational publications, so you can, you know, have a few hundred or, you know, sent to you for your organization, and share them out with members or at events, and just to kind of spread the word about how to keep your pollinators safe. And there's just different topics that are helpful. But I'm just really quickly, because this is really big news, I just want to go back to this slide here. This was just published in the Journal of Insect Science last month, and an article just was released in the last couple of days. I think an entomology publication. Bret or Dave, do you want to just really quickly, we're kind of over time, but if you want to just quickly talk about this, that study that just came out about colonies being exposed to neonics, having more mites?
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment on it. It's, you know, what Dave and I and everybody else that's a beekeeper has observed. It's like Dave talked about, you know, that mite count that was high and you treated and you were done. And then neonics came out, and yeah, the mite threshold. I remember Dr. Gloria DeGrande Hoffman. She was an ARS, or is an ARS researcher down at the Tucson lab, and she at one time had her threshold for treatment at 50, then it went to 25, then it went to 10, then it went to 5, and now I think it's somewhere around 3. And so anyway, almost impossible numbers to try and manage your mite numbers down to. So, you know, and then we knew it was a problem. And the first two formative ideas, or I guess what I would say was just huge, was 2 other science studies. There's a Dr. DiPricio did a paper, and I think it's an Italian study, and he showed there's the presence of neonics in almost unmeasurable amounts. the bees lose their immune function. And so the PSC published a paper trying to, educate people and trying to work on this policy. And it was called The Mites Because. And, everybody wants to manage the mites, and that's a good idea. But why? It's because our immune system's been so compromised with the neonics. And DePricio's work showed that. And then Ohio State, Dr. Reed Johnson found that basically at a cellular level, there's a gene called a P450 gene. And the science is a little bit beyond me, but I can understand the abstracts quite well. And it's basically controls the liver function on a cellular level. And in neonics, that gene is shut off. And so the bee loses his liver function. So not only does he have his immune function is compromised, his liver function is compromised. And that's just with the neonics. Dr. Pettis did some work, and Dr. Jeff Pettis, you guys are probably familiar with his work. He was a USDA researcher at the Beltsville lab, and he found that amounts that were unmeasurable by the best instruments made nosema blow up in bees. And he said, I know it because I put it in there and it was down in the single digits parts per billion. And I think the machines go down to about 5 parts per billion, the best machines. And he said, I had it less than that, but the hives that I doped with that blew up with nosema. So we've known there's a lot of challenges with bee health with the neonics. And now we find you get an explosion of mites. Well, that's just more vectoring of viruses. And then like with that paper I told you that came out of Wisconsin about glyphosate. And this is kind of interesting. It kind of goes back to, oh, you don't like the messengers and message. In the old days, the kings killed the messenger. And Dave was talking about on that neonic map made by USGS. Well, not modern days, that's a little too messy. So when you don't like the message, you just defund the messenger. And so that's why USGS all of a sudden wasn't able to give us that data because they got defunded from collecting that data. And so anyway, it becomes the challenges. It's like, okay, we know the neonics are there, and so going right back around to the whole story, you have to kind of try and do whatever you can to better the situation for bees and for your family.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bret and Dave. That was super great. And I appreciate everyone's questions. If you'll go ahead and put those in the chat, that would be great. And I appreciate Bret and Dave trying to move through this pretty quickly. So this presentation is normally something we would do, at least an hour, and sometimes they're doing presentations like this that are, several hours long for sure. So, so this is a really tiny snapshot. And if you are interested in learning more, the Pollinators movie is really great, but you can also request, a speaker for your organization, that kind of thing. So I have that up on the screen right now, but I thought we would go and look to see if there are some questions in the chat. Dave and Bret, I'm going to read these questions out. So we'll start with Jeff, who says, since losses are high, how do you overcome your losses year to year? How do you protect yourself from those losses? And Jeff, feel free to unmute yourself for this, but I don't know if you're, okay, great.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, we're making up, our operation, and Bret can talk for his own. We're making, and we're in the pollination business, and I'm somewhat semi-retired, and now it's my son's problem and my grandson's problems, but I still involved here. But we're making probably 108% of our bee numbers every year, and it's not sustainable. I mean, I talked earlier about how that 10% was a big deal back in my younger days, and we had time to fish and hunt. Now there's no time to fish, and there's definitely no time to hunt. But because you're working bees, you're working bees constantly. You're making increase constantly, and not just us, but most commercial operations to keep their numbers up, especially if they're operating in areas where there's a lot of seed treatment, corn, especially in the corn and bean parts of the country. or if they've been, exposed to. I mean, there's a lot of exposure to this in California, as Bret, and I talked earlier. So yes, we're beekeepers have become good at what they do and making bees, and it's more it's a depressing, some days it's a depressing thing when you got to go out there and continue to make numbers and see them. My son and grandsons right now are on the Canadian border working bees that came out of Maine, off of blueberry pollination. The use of fungicides on blueberries is astronomical. Davey told me today, he said, we're reaping the benefits again. The bees are starting to show the fungicide damage.
Yeah, it's a continuum. I guess it's one of those accounting things, how you count. So how you want to do your numbers. So, but if you figure your average hive and Bee Informed Partnership, which is run by I think it's the University of New Jersey, the Dennis Van Engelsdorf at one time. They do a lot of statistical analysis. They don't have their field crew like they used to, but they do a lot of statistical analysis, and it's right around 42 to 46% the annualized losses. And so, at one time we had so many bees, we didn't know what to do with them all. We had a lot of them we didn't make divides for, or didn't have to requeen, and we'd run them 2 years. And so it's just changed the workload tremendously. And if you have, an anomaly, a dry year and a lot of spraying, you might be losing 70 or 80% of them. And then it's everything you can do to get restocked. And you'll have to go through and pull brood and make nukes then, and then go through and then divide the hive and look up your old queen, because, she's been exposed and going to fail. And so you have to go through them all twice to get your numbers back. And then you start out and, we used to figure the queen takes usually staying about the same, but our summer losses used to be non-existent. It's like you have your queen take and 1 or 2% trucking loss, and that would be it. And you maybe pick up 1 or 2% throughout the whole summer. Now, there's probably not a summer that you don't pick up 20% of your hives. So yeah, it's a continuum. And so you have to just kind of readjust what your target number is. It's like what you think you can pollinate with. And there was a corporate entity out on the West Coast, a big pollination grower, corporate grower, and deep pockets and very successful family. And they decided they were going to get into the bee business. And, they were going to buy a whole bunch of bees. And I told them, well, you're going to have to buy twice as many as that. And they thought I was just arrogant and cocky. And about 3 years later, their manager says, you're right on the money. We're only able to put half of what we own into our crops every year. The other half are dead by the time our crops get here. So anyway, there's different ways of doing it. If you want to, if you're going to need 1,000 hives for your crops and you're going to be vertically integrated and own the bees, you better own 2,000 hives if you want 1,000 hives for your crops. And if you're a beekeeper and you need this much income, you've got to figure, well, if this is my pollination income, this is my honey income. So, and figure your poundages. And there's 2 things that have happened during this too. There's not only the life of the bee, but then there's been a poundage slippage for what the hives will yield, because if you're dividing them real hard, like a 4-to-1 or a 6-to-1, trying to fill your equipment back up, you're sometimes making them not an ideal size where they'll produce honey. By the time they get built up, the honey crop is done. So, I don't know what the honey productive capacity of the nation is anymore. I do know what the numbers are, what we are producing. And when I was first into bees in the 1980s, the nation produced somewhere between 250 to 280 million pounds. And the last 5 years, we've been right around 125 million pounds. So we've lost over half of our productive capacity. And a lot of that may be due to herbicides, but a lot of it is also probably due to the amount of dividing we have to do, and the bees aren't strong enough to capture the honey that's out there. So anyway, it's multifaceted what you end up doing to try and, keep this as a commercial operation to feed your family.
So it looks like we have 3 questions currently remaining, so I just want to make sure that we have time for them. So Anthony had asked, what do you think of certain states' efforts to ban neonics in agriculture ahead of the federal government doing so? The U.S. lags behind many European countries also in this area, and also said, thank you, great presentation. So yeah, I mean, PSC has been supporting some of those efforts in a state. If you receive our newsletter, we try to really keep up to date on that and allow people the opportunity whenever possible to weigh in at the state level or the local level. I think that the last newsletter we had an article just showing this, like, kind of it's become just like this this movement. I think that from what I'm seeing, I think that that's really growing. Dave or Bret, and maybe Dave or Bret, this is what you're mentioning. One of the things where you're saying you're feeling hopeful that the tide is kind of changing, and that it does seem like that with the local those local bands. Dave or Bret, do you have any quick thing to add on that?
Well, there's a movement in Minnesota, New York, and some other places. Although they're facing legal challenges, you got to understand that we're talking about the people that have the big dollars. I mean, when in our days, Bret's and my days of dealing with EPA, they talk about the industry. They're not talking about the carb industry. They're not talking about farming industry. That's the industry and everybody else. They're talking about the chemical people, and that's the people that's got the dollars. I mean, it's a very. I mean, if he was in Bret's or my shoes and spent as much time we did on committees for EPA committees, that dialogue committees and advisory boards and stuff the EPA had, it's very obvious that, like a good friend of mine, Dave Mendy, some of you know Dave, he said it's the golden rule. He who has the golden rule.
So anyway, I'll make a short comment on that. And yeah, we have the New York and Minnesota are both pushing that. And then there's a lot of bootlegging that goes on. Seed that still goes into because the treated article exemption gets bootlegged into New York. But where I think it's encouraging is there was a Jamie Ellis, I think, did it, and there was a survey, a global survey of longevity of bees. And what stood out really interestingly is Ontario in Canada has banned this, and most of the European countries have banned the neonics for bee attractive crops. And the longevity of their hives or their hive survival rate has gone up way above what we're at, almost 25% above where we're at for their hive survival rate. It was an interesting statistical analysis. It's like, whoa, look at this. The areas where they've banned neonics on bee attractive plants, we have a longer survival rate for bees. So anyway, I thought that was encouraging and very telling. And it's probably one of those things, as Dave referred to, the industry doesn't like those statistics, but they're real statistics.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Terry, who says, do you have suggestions on how to successfully discuss this with beekeepers who only see bees through a mite control lens? Meaning they'll discuss mites until the cows come home, but they don't think poisoned forage is worth thinking about. If beekeepers and associations spoke about pesticides as much as they do about mites, it could be a different world. So do either of you have any input on that or suggestions on how to be successful to kind of like help bring other beekeepers into that type of conversation?
I would suggest just be well studied. We have more documentation in our archives, and I would say this one that just came out that Jennifer put up here is very fundamental, shows how the neonics blow them up. The Deprecio study, I don't think there's anything more telling than that shows your immune function shut off. So all of a sudden mites become, what was a background virus, all of a sudden becomes a pathogenic virus. And then Reed Johnson's work is very telling. I mean, just study. And so, you can bring it up in a conversation. It's like, yeah, but there's a reason we have to treat mites so seriously and why the threshold keeps getting dropped. And I would tell you this too, Diane Cox Foster, like I said, I've studied this enough to have a doctorate in it, but just did a study up in Utah in the mountains there, really close to where that beekeeper I told you had the mountain bees. And they brought in bees from agri situations, put them up in the mountains. She measured the viral load in them, and all summer long, as the bees got good, clean forage out of the high mountains of Utah, the viral load disappeared and the bees became more vigorant. And so, anyway, her work is very foundational. She's got it published, and peer reviewed. And I've seen the pre-release, but she is having to fight all the institutions to get it released because they do not want it released. I have a neighbor up here, Dr. Jonathan Longrum. You could look him up. He runs the Adee Foundation now. He was a top USDA scientist he won an award when Obama was president for Young Scientist of the Year. I believe they give 5 of these awards out nationally, and you have to be under 40 to win it. And he'd won it. And he made a comment on RNAi, and we just heard about RNAi, which was in the vaccine shots that we had for COVID. And now it's being used in corn genetics to, put out basically to reprogram corn borer. And he wrote a paper on that, and it was such a good paper. It was received, and he won an award of excellence from the National Science Foundation. He was considered one of the Young Scientists of the Year, won an award for that. And he went to publish it, and USDA basically said, withdraw it. And I don't know if he didn't withdraw it, but he went to go receive an award from the National Science Foundation. And you would think you'd want your scientists receiving awards like this, but they fired him for going out there to get that award. They said, oh, that was insubordination. So they fired him. So anyway, there is a ton of good science out there. There are some very solid scientists that have lost their careers for publishing what is right and truthful. And I would just say, study so you can, bring up the facts, figures, and back it up with hard science. I mean, and then you can bring in your own experiential experiences and say, hey, this is what I've seen, and this is what the science says. Smell the coffee, guys. But forage is a huge cure. If we had good, clean forage, a big percentage of our problems would go away. Diane's work shows that, and these other top-notch scientists' work document what all of us beekeepers have seen, and we know it anecdotally from our own operations, but they've got the science, the numbers, and the statistics to take it to court. And so study it, and I wouldn't be in your face, but just make it comparisons to what you're seeing to what the scientists have said, and try and bring it up. It's like, so it becomes deeper than yourself, so you can say, hey, these top-notch men have also observed this, and they got the statistics on it. I said, you're saying that you're not a top-notch man, but look at the statistics they came up with, and just, don't make it a personal fight, but just make it an intellectual presentation. And so the best way to do that is study it.
Great, thank you, Bret. I have one more question really quick, and we're just about at the hour, but let's go ahead and get this one. Anthony asks, are there other areas of bees and mites research that should be happening that isn't at this time? So like dsRNA on Varroa, note virus research for vaccines and treatments, those kinds of things.
Well, we got a new mite coming out.
Does anyone want to take
South? We have a new mite coming out of South Asia already, probably in the Ukraine, Trepolilites. And we was on the Hill, some of us last week, trying to find $9 million for research to get to the bottom of this thing. This mite is so small that it looks like it don't even look like a pinhead. And it's a friend of mine was over there in January. They actually burned their clothes because they're so concerned that this mite also rides on other things besides the honeybees. They've now figured out it might even ride on mice and rats. So it's and the first year it killed 50% of the bees. I think in Thailand, it took about 2 years to wipe out most of the population in some other countries. So all they run now is small beehives over there, so they can and production of honey is kind of going away, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Sadly, that mite pretty much eliminates honey production and would just make the pollination industry and the only viable thing in the country. And, you know, I don't know if you could even do it economically as a good way to take care of your family. It's just, yeah, that's a big red flag on the horizon. And one of the things Dave didn't mention is, you know, Canada imports honeybees from all over the world, and both the national trade associations have been trying to get Canada to you know, look at closing their borders to these global imports of bees, because that's the last thing we need is a global parasite imported into Canada and then come across a political boundary, not a physical boundary, because if Canada will have it, we'll have it. And so anyway, it's one of the things the trade associations are trying to work on. And some people are trying to get the Canadians to buy their queens and packages from the United States. And personally, I think that's immaterial. I think the main thing is they close their border, and if they want to buy stuff from us, that's fine. But if they want to raise it themselves, that's fine. But the main thing is don't bring in a parasite into North America that we don't have. We already have enough challenges.
We are at the hour, and I appreciate everybody's time. You might see pop up on your screen just a 4-question little survey. If you wouldn't mind answering that, that helps us, you know, kind of get some information about what we could offer in the future. Question 4 is other questions or comments. So if you have an idea of a webinar or a workshop that you would like to attend in the future, please do put it there. I'd love to see just get some ideas. The other thing is, if you have not signed up for our newsletter, you can use that QR code or the web link to go and sign up for the newsletter. It really is a great way to stay in contact with news, research. We always have some pesticide news every single month, and then we also have opportunities for educational opportunities or you know, advocacy opportunities that you could do in your region or nationally. So I appreciate everybody's time. Dave and Bret, that was super great, and yeah, it's just kind of incredible to be part of this organization. There's just it's just a huge body of knowledge with the board here. And so again, please reach out to us if you have any interest in attending other things or hosting a speaker, that kind of thing in the future. Again, we really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.